Hi, hello and welcome to IB History Revision. Today we will be looking at the move to global war, Japanese expansion in part 1 of the series, which will cover the events from the Meiji Restoration all the way up to the events of the early 1930s. So first of all, let us now look at who was important in the, so to say, old Japan. So first of all, we have the emperor.
I am a living god.
Then we have the shogun.
I am a powerful military leader.
And the daimyo.
I am a baron.
And the samurai.
I am a warrior.
Let's look at what Japan was like before 1868. What we find in Japan during that time is a strict class system, which was hereditary. This meant that you were born into your class and that there was little movement between the classes. Another source of tension in Japan during that time between the classes were things such as the merchant tax, which is basically where the Japanese peasants say,
"Why do we have to give part of our money to the samurai?"
Another source of tension in Japan are the battling daimyos who all fight for power within the nation. Japan also doesn't have a central tax system and they lack a national army. Furthermore, Japan tries to isolate itself from the rest of the world. They do so because they fear that they will lose their independence to a foreign power and especially that Western powers might impose their values onto Japanese culture. Finally, Matthew Perry and the US Navy approach Japan and say,
"Open your border!"
And so Japan opens its borders after some consideration, and there are some rebellions such as the Battle of Shiroyama, but they are quickly crushed. Furthermore, Japan is now forced to change as a society that had essentially existed for centuries, and now Japan is finally able to move into the Meiji Restoration. During the Meiji Restoration, Japan seeks to turn itself into a modern, or if you will, civilized country. Japan wants to unify under the phrase rich country, strong army. They also adopt Western ideas. This means that they introduce conscription, they end feudalism. So, for example, a peasant was now a citizen. They introduce mass education. This is a really useful statistic you might want to use in your essay. So, while in 1875 only 45% of children in Japan went to school, by 1905 98% attended. They also adopted Western dress and developed their economy, meaning that capitalism was emerging.
Japan to the moon!
Let's look at some of the Western and Japanese ideas which were essentially added together to form a new Japanese society. So for the Western ideas we have conscription, the end to the feudal system, the introduction of mass education, the adaptation of Western dress, and economic privatization. For the Japanese ideas which were kept, we have that they continued to practice emperor worship, they reintroduced Shinto as state religion, they kept traditional family roles, and the samurai remained aristocracy in Japan.
We have a divine emperor. We have not been conquered by European power. Historically speaking, we have been independent. We share a common culture which unites us. We also just defeated Russia. It's rare that a European power loses to a non-European power. I call that a dub. Lastly, we are respected in the world because we are the leading power in Asia. We are on a special mission. Hooray! Japan!
So now we move on to militarism before the First World War. This includes Korea from 1876 to 1905, the First Sino-Japanese War from 1894 to 95, the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895, the Anglo-Japanese Alliance in 1902, the Russian-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905, and the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905. The consequences of Korea were as follows. Korea was no longer a tributary state to China. Japanese citizens could not be arrested or tried in Korean courts. Korea could not impose any restrictions on Japanese trade, and Japan was allowed to use Korean ports for its exports. It was also the cause of the First Sino-Japanese War with the assassination of the opposition leader in 1884, and Korea asked China for help. What were the consequences of the Sino-Japanese War? First of all, the war resulted in a decisive Japanese victory. It gave them the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Japan now had control of Taiwan, could use Chinese factories and ports, and made China pay reparations. On the other hand, Japan's victory was undermined by the tripartite intervention. This meant that Russia and Germany gained territories initially conquered by Japan. For example, Port Arthur went to the Russians. So what were the consequences of the Anglo-Japanese alliance? First of all, Japan and Britain would now aid each other militarily if either was at war with two or more countries. If either country was at war with only one other state, then the other would remain neutral. Therefore, remember,
the treaty was directed at Russia. It allowed Japan to solely focus on a Russian threat in the event of war.
Let's look at the events and consequences of the Russo-Japanese War. The Japanese artillery destroys the Russian navy at Port Arthur, and Japan gains control of Mukden. Russia's navy is ultimately destroyed, and a Russian revolution erupts, and the country ultimately sues for peace. This gives Japan the peace treaty, the Treaty of Portsmouth. So now Manchuria returns to Chinese control. Japan gains access to the South Manchurian Railway, Port Arthur, and the Liaodong Peninsula. Also, Japan's claim on Korea is internationally recognized. However, Japan doesn't receive reparations from Russia, and the treaty as a whole and the war present unsatisfying territorial gains. Here are a couple of key terms you might use in relation to militarism and nationalism and how they impacted Japan's foreign policy. Feudalism, meaning that there was little movement between the classes. Conservatism and modernization. Traditional society clashed with Western influences and the adaptation of modern needs. And militarism, the belief that the nation must protect itself with a strong military. The military had a high standing and was very influential. So by now the First World War has rolled around, and Japan is able to see this as a great opportunity to show its newly acquired strength. For example, the case of the Shantung Peninsula in 1914. Here Japan takes control of previously German-owned provinces, such as the Shantung Peninsula. There is also the case of China in 1915, where Japan issues 21 demands to China. China is ultimately forced to accept them due to its weakness, and Japan's influence in Manchuria is increased. This does, however, concern the UK and the USA due to a prospect of Japanese aggression. If you really want to know what the Japanese were like during that time, listen to this quote by Theodore Roosevelt.
But with Japan, the case is different. She is a most formidable military power. Her people have peculiar fighting capacity. They are very proud, very warlike.
The First World War is over and peace is settled at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, where Japan is allowed to join the newly formed League of Nations, and the idea of the League is collective security, so the concept that all members of the League protect each other in the event that one should be threatened. Japan also demands a clause against racial discrimination, but is denied this by the Western powers, who still don't see them as equals, and Japan is granted supervision but not direct annexation of Pacific colonies. The US also wants to limit Japan's ambitions in China specifically, and this can be seen with the Shantung Peninsula, which was supposed to be given to China. The aftermath of the First World War and the Paris Peace Conference is that Japan was now forced to be reckoned with militarily and politically, and Japan introduced conscription and increased its naval capacity. The interwar treaties. This is a clash between the Japanese military and the more cautious parts of the Japanese government, which still try to keep a low profile. There is a situation in which the Japanese military pressures its government to maintain its strength militarily speaking and increase its territory. The more cautious parts of the government, however, are still shy to provoke powers such as the US, Britain, and others, and this introduces Shirihara diplomacy.
We need to have a foreign policy which reassures foreign powers such as the United States and the United Kingdom, while also allowing our military to expand. This policy is known as Shirihara diplomacy, named after me!
The first interwar treaty you should know about is the Washington Naval Conference of 1922. Its main priority was to reduce the amount of armament. As a result, large battleship construction was halted for 10 years. Some battleships were even scrapped, and Britain and the US agreed to not build fortifications in the Pacific, with the exception of Pearl Harbor. Furthermore, all nations had to respect China's independence, and Japan's navy size was reduced to 60% of that of the US. The second interwar treaty you should know about is the London Naval Conference in 1930. This was designed to review the Washington Naval Conference, and as a result, it had a slight increase in the ratio of allowed battleships. In Japan, the Prime Minister Tsuyoshi was assassinated by the ultranationalist group League of Blood, who believed that the terms did not go far enough.
History man has noticed a pattern. Japan performs well in military conflict, only to be undermined by unsatisfying post-war treaties.
Here's a summary of all the factors that led to growing militarism in Japan and ultimately increased military spending and growing radical nationalism. The Zaibatsu. The Zaibatsu were huge corporations, in reality monopolies in Japan, which were owned by few families. They were the beneficiaries of rapid industrialization and of economic instability, such as the Great Depression, where they ate up smaller businesses. This can be seen by the pattern on the slide here, which basically always reoccurred, and the Zaibatsu presence in politics led to alliances with the military, and deals led to increased militarism by encouraging growth and production. The Great Depression occurred in 1929 in the US and spread to other countries throughout the world. These countries would then introduce trade barriers, and Japan was essentially cut off from really important resources. Japan's GNP declined by 20% between 1929 and 1931, and stocks in Japan lost half of their value. Furthermore, 50% of medium-sized businesses closed down permanently. Exports also fell by 40% and unemployment skyrocketed. Unemployment and hunger led to political unrest, and strikes and riots increased the support for extremist movements. This saw a change in policy after the assassination of the finance minister, who was replaced by a military officer, which increased military influence in the government. Modernization and increased military spending. The military-controlled government introduced a 12-year plan in 1936 with the aim of modernizing and expanding the armed forces in Japan and ultimately the territory Japan owned.
I have a theory. Labor shortages plus more economy equals more war.
There were a bunch of domestic instabilities in Japan. Firstly, the communists, who wanted to overthrow the government and create equality for all. Secondly, there was the Showa Restoration, where conservatives wanted direct control to be given to the Showa emperor. There was constitutional weakness, where policies, for example, required unanimous approval by all ministers. Lastly, there was a divided military. So there were the reformers, which wanted to prepare for a war with China, and there were the extremists, which wanted to destroy the government and have a war with the Soviet Union. There was also three important foreign instabilities. Firstly, the warlord era in China, where China was dominated by regional warlords. Then there was an independent Manchuria, which was seen as a threat by the Japanese army. And then there was southern China, which struggled with unification and ultimately lost the Soviet Union as a potential ally. Let's ask History Man what he thinks we should remember from this video.
History Man says, remember this. Rapid industrialization led to the growth of the Japanese economy, allowing it to pursue an expansionist foreign policy. Japan demonstrated its power regionally, but was undermined by international intervention and domestic issues. Until and during the 1930s, Militarism increased in Japan, and the way to war began to be paved. History Man thanks you for watching and hopes to see you in part 2.